So, excellent. Good. So we are talking about a really important subject, like I said, is very close to my heart, navigating the labyrinth of life and loss through compassion and neuroscience. Never before do I think it's been as important as it is now to have these kinds of conversations. And it's so interesting to me that we live in such a grief and trauma illiterate society that we're not continually having these kinds of conversations. So thank you for joining me. This sometimes may be a tough conversation to hear. It might be triggering for some of you with certain experiences that you have had. So please make sure that you self-care, you give yourself and anyone around you loving kindness as you learn about grief and trauma, and do your best to manage yourself in whatever way is going to be the best for you today. So we are going to be recording the call. Very happy to engage with the chat. I'm being really kindly and ably assisted today by Brent. Brent, do you want to show your video so we can say hi to you? Brent, a longtime colleague of mine, and he's going to be in the background navigating with the chat and anything else that we need as we go along. So really feel free to interact with me as we go. Good. So really going to be talking to you about these really real subjects, important subjects, and from the lens of neuroscience, which I really feel adds a kind of credibility and validity to some subjects which can be a little intangible and sometimes difficult to navigate. So why are we here today? Partly and mostly because of you, because you want to know about not only supporting yourself through difficult times, but also supporting others through difficult times. So you may be here in the role of partner, parent, teacher. I know I've got a lot of coaches on the call today, other healthcare workers, therapists. So it's to support you to understand the neurobiology of grief, as well as to have strategies to manage grief and trauma. I'm also here because of myself, because of my life experiences have been deeply steeped in traumatic and grief experiences. I feel like I've walked the walk, and doing this kind of work has been the greatest gift to me. It's allowed me to live a life of purpose and meaning through what can be really difficult experiences. And then, of course, us, because I believe that we're living in such an individualistic society. And exactly like I was saying, we are pretty much grief and trauma illiterate. And grief and trauma are a collaborative experience and can be mitigated and navigated so much more effectively when we do it as a social group rather than as individuals. So what I'm going to be discussing today is understanding exactly what is grief and connecting it to trauma, and also understanding the neurobiology of trauma and bereavement. So not going into difficult science, but giving you the scientific basis. And often as a trauma counselor, as a grief counselor, when people just understand what is actually happening to them, it has a great impact on helping them navigate what is happening so much better. And then we're going to talk about these techniques, these strategies. Many of you are struggling with the other people's experiences because you are empathic towards other people. So how do we support other people to navigate these experiences, as well as our own emotions, observing people that we care about or people that we are professionally engaged with, navigating these experiences, and how do we navigate them ourselves? So at the end of the call, we're going to stop the recording, and I'm going to be giving you a link to a whole lot of resources that are prepared for you. For those of you who are professionals, there is a certificate of ongoing education, so you can download the certificate. I have also put all the slides up, so you can get all the slides from today. There will be the recording put there as soon as we have edited it, and also a couple of other goodies, discount codes, etc. So that will come right at the end, and I will stop the recording before we go, because it's the resources are for the people who are attending here tonight. Good. So let's start talking about exactly what grief is. Essentially, the essence of grief is that it is a response to loss. It's a response to loss and closely connected to trauma. Where there is grief, there is trauma. All grief is trauma. And to a large extent, most trauma is connected to grief, because trauma as a shocking or emotionally overwhelming situation that may involve actual or threatened death or injury or other disturbance, other kinds of distress, means a loss. So I'm going to bring grief and trauma together as a concept. Sometimes I'll differentiate between the two, but generally I'm speaking about both. It's a complex constellation of emotions, including sadness, anger, bitterness, guilt, distress, despair, almost any word that you can think of, emotional word, even sometimes joy and sometimes curiosity, and even positive words may sometimes be associated with this experience. It is universal and it's personal. When I'm saying it's universal, it's because all people go through grief experiences. However, our own grief experience is completely personal to us. And I'll show you how we never need to say to somebody, I know exactly what you're going through, because nobody ever does. Our experience of whatever tragedy it is that we're experiencing is completely personal to us. Grief is inevitable and it's optional. As the Buddha said, if you love, you will grieve. So that's what I mean by optional. If you're not going to love, then you're not going to grieve. But every person is going to go through some kind of grief experience. It's not only an experience of the mind, but it's also an experience of the body. And there are massive physiological shifts that happen in your endocrine system, your immune system, your autonomic nervous system, even your cardiovascular system. I'm going to give you some really profound stories about broken heart, broken brain, the connection between the two. So the time thing, it can last for months, it can last for years, and it can last forever. The healing and the navigating through grief means that the pain of grief lessens over time. But time is a factor in grief. It is not a condolence. So another thing, never say, don't worry, you'll feel better in a year. And we cannot control it. We can't stop it, but we may be able to learn techniques to navigate it more effectively. So I'm just going to start then by telling you a little bit about the brain. I know a lot of people on the call do understand many aspects of the neuroscience, and I'm not going to get too complicated about it, but I just want to give us a language so that we can all really understand and explain to people what is actually happening to them when they experience distressing occurrences or a grief or loss or trauma. So I'm a grief counselor, I'm a trauma counselor, and when we do grief and trauma debriefing, people find it incredibly useful to understand, actually, this is what was happening in my brain and in my whole physiology. In fact, it really gives people almost a handle and a language to then be able to navigate through it. So here I've got a cross-section through a beautiful brain. Those of you who know me know that I'm really passionate about everything neuro. And the most prominently conscious and I guess advanced in a way part of our brain, if we're looking at it from a cognitive development point of view, is this part of our brain right behind our forehead called the prefrontal cortex. So this is our decision-making brain right here behind your forehead. This is the part of the brain where you memorize, you recall. This is where you inhibit behavior. It's kind of your thinking, rational, reasoning part of your brain. And then we have the limbic system. Again, I'm talking about an incredibly complex organ in a really simplistic way. The limbic system is your instinctive brain, it's your reactive brain. We talk about it as being the survival brain, and very, very much closely linked to your emotional brain. Now, what we have to understand is this outer part of the brain, this outer covering, which is the cerebral cortex. Actually, I'm pointing to it, but I'm not using my pointer. Let me use my pointer. This outermost part of the brain here, the cerebral cortex, is all the parts to do with our higher human functions. However, it is only a wrapping around the brain. It's about the thickness of the rind of a grapefruit. And so our higher functions actually take up incredibly small amounts of space in terms of the topography of our brain. And the whole of the inside of the brain is taken up more by this instinctive, reactive, survival, more ancient parts of our brain. Another important part for us to discuss when we're talking about trauma and grief is the amygdala, the good old amygdala. I'm sure all of you have heard of the amygdala hijack. And now this amygdala hangs out right between your prefrontal cortex and your limbic system. Okay, so it's subconscious, it's not part of your conscious brain, but it's the part of the brain that is there to ready your fear response. Okay, and at all times, your amygdala is alert and alive and well. In this moment, as you're sitting listening to me speaking, we have a part of the brain called the error detection mechanism, which is there to navigate to the amygdala at any stage to say, we're in trouble. So even right now, your amygdala is ready to alert your whole physiology to respond and survive. Another important part of the brain I want to mention in terms of trauma and grief is the hippocampus, which is also right there in the middle of the limbic system. This is the part of the brain to do with long-term memory. Now, there's anyone sitting on this call who's had a frightening experience, anyone who's had a shock, a trauma, or even that phone call when you got that bad news, I'm afraid to say it's there forever. Because this hippocampus is so deep in our limbic system, surrounded by our emotional and survival brain, that any traumatic and dramatic experience is burnt into our long-term memory. So the techniques that I'm going to teach you is how do we mediate and mitigate the impact of that memory of trauma so that we are not constantly re-traumatized and revisiting the moment of pain and fear that we experienced. So think about what happens when you have a frightening experience. Okay, that phone call where the bad news comes in, or you're driving down the road and there's a gun to your head. Those of us in South Africa here tonight know that that can happen. Or the saber-toothed tiger jumps out in front of you. Instantaneously, as we have a traumatic experience, it is like an attack on our brain. And we have an instant physiological response. So what happens in that moment when suddenly the saber-toothed tiger jumps out in front of me, this little amygdala sends a message down my spinal cord here to my adrenal glands to release adrenaline into the system. And what does the adrenaline do? It makes my heart beat faster so the blood can go to my muscles so I can fight off the attacker. It makes me breathe rapid and shallow so the oxygen can go to my muscles so I can become powerful enough to run as far as I can. It makes my stomach clench so that I'm not using my digestive system, but rather using my muscles in order to survive. Instantaneously, when there is a threat to my survival, I will have a response that is designed to keep me alive, and I'm sure most of you have heard of it, called fight, flight, or freeze. So the neurochemistry of trauma and grief is that in that moment, when the amygdala stimulates the adrenal glands, adrenaline and the corresponding neurochemical called norepinephrine is released through my brain, and so is a substance called cortisol. And what is cortisol? Your stress neurochemical. Now think of what's happening at the moment. We have got this constant outpouring of stress neurochemicals because of what we're going through 2020, 21, 22, where we have got COVID. Am I going to be able to get on a flight or not? Is my job safe? Am I going to get ill? Am I losing a loved one or not? Constantly, we have got this excessive outpouring of adrenaline and cortisol into our system. And what does the cortisol do? What is the impact of cortisol? Is it's a neural inhibitor. It stops my brain from thinking. And that is why when you're in distress, when you're going through these reactive experiences where you're having to react, you can't think clearly. You know, people are talking about the COVID brain fog. I'm actually thinking it's trauma brain fog sometimes, brain fog, not frog, brain fog, rather than the actual illness itself. And what happens is, as this adrenaline and as this cortisol rises in our system, so the dopamine drops. Dopamine is excitement and motivation. People are feeling flat. They're feeling exhausted. The serotonin drops. People are feeling depressed. And what happens is our oxytocin is affected. Oxytocin is the neurochemical to do with connection. And what happens when we're in trauma, when we're under stress, people isolate. So the impact of this entire neurochemistry has a massive effect on our biology, our physiology, as well as our psychology. And we get the side effects of things like insomnia, things like hypervigilance. You might find out that you're watching out for the next bad thing that could happen. You know, if you've been attacked, you now see potential attackers everywhere. We generalize what has happened to us and see problems everywhere. When I'm calm and contained, I'm not alert to anything that could go wrong. We become pessimistic. People are negative at the moment because why? Dopamine low, serotonin's low. And I also need to be really pessimistic if my life is in danger. I don't need to be all happy and excited. I need to think that something could go wrong. Okay, a whole lot of these, things like you might have heard of dissociation, where people feel disconnected. People are confused. They're feeling constant anxiety and hyperarousal. All of these symptoms are the impact of this attack that is happening on our brain and our physiology. And I'm going to talk to you about how important it is for ourselves, if we're going through it, to normalize it for ourselves. And if other people are going through it, how can we normalize it for other people? And I've got a story for you that is really, I think, pretty poignant. And it was a story that was actually written by a school friend of mine, Kate Sidley. She talks about this concept, which is called broken heart syndrome. So first she talks about a journalist by the name of Suna Fenter. And she was a journalist at the SABC, and she was exposing the corruption that was happening. And she was harassed, she was threatened, she was shot at, she was tied to a tree, and the grass was lit around her in the Melville Koppies. Okay, and she died at the age of 32 from what doctors called broken heart syndrome. And 6 decades apart and a world apart, Moses Qadi, who was a magnificent African painter, he was harassed and persecuted in the 50s by the black spot removals of the apartheid government. And he put down his paintbrush as he was taken from his home. He never picked it up again and died a few weeks later, his children said, of a broken heart. The statistics of people dying from cardiovascular issues soon after a loss are extraordinarily high. Do not underestimate the impact of our brain on our physiology. Okay, so I just love to get a bit of interaction from you and see what people are thinking of, and I'm wanting to know what I need to speak to. So if you can, on the chat, I'd love it if any of you could put, what is the threat that you are facing currently? What is the grief experience? What are the traumas that you are facing currently in 2020, 2021, 2022? I know for me, there's been extraordinary amounts of threat experiences that I wouldn't normally have had. Yeah, common uncertainty, this constant uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen next. just when we think that we've solved and we're normalizing with COVID, and then the war in Europe starts. Just when the war in Europe, okay, we all know what it is that we are facing. Okay, constant health worries, absolutely, and disappointments, yes, being let down, expectations. It's a massive, there's all science behind the massive drop in dopamine that occurs when our expectations are not met. It's almost worse than the event itself by actually just having the expectation, our expectations disappointed. Being away from loved ones, Vanitha. Okay, and also, yes, having to be the caregivers for so many people and not having the education about how to care for people. Anniversaries of passing, sure, reach the change that's happening. I'll talk about identities and roles because a lot of grief is about grieving our past identity and having to come to terms with some kind of new identity that I haven't yet established. Okay, thank you, everyone. Evacuating, lockdown, people that we love experiencing disorders and pain. Okay, it's sure, 5 funerals in recent weeks. A lot of trauma and difficulties are going on right now. So I know many of you have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's grief cycles. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I did want to mention it. There's a lot of people who criticize the cycles of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross researched and came up with these experiences that we go through as a grief experience with people who were going through end-of-life experiences. Okay, and but it's since been kind of transferred into a grief experience. The thing is that people say it's not accurate because it's linear. And Kubler-Ross herself says, I never meant people to see this as a linear process. It is a cyclical process. We go in and out of all of these experiences. So initially things are stable. We were there in 2020. Everything was fine, planning our lives ahead. And the next thing we hear, there's COVID. Or that phone rings and you get the news. Now, I don't know about you, but when I've had bad news, I remember that moment for the rest of my life with clarity. I remember the temperature of the air, what the sun felt like. It was everything becomes burnt into that hippocampus, our long-term memory. We initially are immobilized. And then we cycle through these different experiences. The denial is the brain's way of pacing grief. I have a theory that actually our brain is too sophisticated to actually accept grief. I think it's too much for our brains to manage. So we go into this denial. I was counseling a couple who had lost their daughter, who was on the back of we call it a bakkie in South Africa, like an open truck. And they were driving down a sand road and their daughter was thrown off the back and she was killed. This couple believed implicitly that she was going to be resurrected. They had degrees, they knew that it wasn't going to happen, but they could not accept the fact of her death. And people go into anger. You saw with COVID how angry we got, and it wasn't just because Cyril Ramaphosa banned our Chardonnay, but people get angry about things because why? It's that depletion of our resources that we can't contain ourselves anymore. The bargaining is also a famous researcher by the name of Bowlby called this the yearning and searching phase. You know, it's almost, if I could just see them, I could, and that you dream about them and you feel, okay, it's as if they're there. And then the depression, which is the complete depletion of all our metabolic resources. And we go cycling through all of these stages until finally we need to move into acceptance. It's not that healing happens. It's, grief is not like getting over flu. You don't get over a dead one, but you move into a space of acceptance. So I'm going to teach you now and talk to you about how do we support ourselves and how do we support other people to navigate these experiences. And I'm going to start talking to you about empathy. So I've created a graph here, which really ranges on the x-axis from completely passive on the left to active on the right, and on the y-axis from rescuing at the bottom to empowering at the top. So if we start navigating through this, this graph, if we're not even on the graph and somebody is going through experience, this is where people invalidate or ignore. This is where we're completely disengaged. And you better believe there's many people that sit right off the graph, often because they just don't know how to engage with what is happening to either themselves or other people. Right at the bottom, we have pity. Okay, pity is kind of, it's implicitly saying, well, this poor person, they don't deserve help, you know, we can't prevent, we can't do anything about the situation, so I will pity them. It's a little bit better than invalidating, but it's still not really proactive or active. We move from pity, from feeling sorry, acknowledging the person's got something wrong, to sympathy. And sympathy is where I understand your feelings and I really care. Kind of send a sympathy card. So this is, I always like the story of the guy who lived under the gutter during the first lockdown outside my house. And this is where a lot of people ignored him. A lot of people went, oh, shame, that poor guy. And the messages went round the WhatsApp groups in my complex about, shame, have you seen the guy living in the gutter outside our complex? And then the sympathy cards and sometimes sympathy duvets or clothes being given to this person. Empathy is a step above that. And every one of you that is sitting on this call is here because you're an empath. Otherwise, you wouldn't be interested in the subject. And empathy is understanding and sharing a person's feelings and wanting to help out, wanting to support that person. And that is a wonderful thing. But I am going to talk to you a little bit about beyond empathy. But I've got a beautiful short video to show you about from Brené Brown, love her or hate her. I think she's great at times, talking about empathy.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So I thought that was pretty cute. And also, important because, Vinitha, I see you saying there about confusion as a leading state of mind. It's kind of any state of mind, any feeling, as you're going to see that we experience, whatever it is that you're feeling is a valid experience and feeling of grief. I also wanted to emphasize also from the comments on the chat that grief is not only loss of death, but it can be grieving the loss of a marriage, divorce, the loss of a job, the certainty and uncertainty that we were talking about, the loss of a pet. I've just had a friend go through incredible grief over the loss of her most beloved little dog. Infertility, the loss of the ability, of which we always presume I'll be able to have a child, the loss of your kids leaving home, okay, immigration. People really are suffering with a lot of trauma from families being split up, physical impairment, ill health, Alzheimer's, okay, Alzheimer's, they call it the long goodbye. It's that we call it anticipatory grief, where we know that eventually we're going to lose that person, and losing them little bit by little bit is incredibly traumatic. Now, I wanted to go a step beyond empathy because, and I was largely pressed to this by my teaching coaches about how to sit with people who are navigating difficult experiences, because coaches, therapists, counselors are not always moving towards goals and happy outcomes, but often sitting with people going through traumas and difficult experiences. Never before in my 17 years of practice have I had the intensity of pain that I've sat with daily with my clients. My coaching has shifted quite profoundly from performance and goal setting and outcome focused only coaching. But now we're having to help people navigate through these difficult experiences. So I did a lot of thinking and a lot of research on this to find a way to anchor my coaches in a way to sit with empathy, which is a beautiful, beautiful quality. And that's why they're drawn to these professions, to sit with empathy, but also to be able to stay empowered and be empowering in that experience. And so I started to investigate compassion. Now, I like the story of the hospice care worker, where the hospice care worker, for me, is one of the ultimate expressions of compassion, because she or he is sitting and supporting people through end of life. Can you imagine if that hospice care worker took that on themselves, of that person's dying and that person's pain? They wouldn't be able to stay in the profession. However, what they do and how they navigate through is knowing that this person is going to pass on. They are not attached to an outcome, a particular outcome. They have that empathic nature where they can share and understand that person's experience, but what they're able to do is support that person to navigate the difficult experiences themselves skillfully and with wisdom. And this is empowerment, and this is enablement. And I know I'm making it sound easier than it is, but I'm going to go into some more details about this. The Latin word for compassion comes from the Latin word pati, which is to suffer, and com is with. To be able to sit with people's pain, but not experience empathy, fatigue, secondary traumatization, vicarious burnout, because that is what a lot of people are sitting with, watching your loved ones, I'm seeing here in the chat, watching and experiencing others. Just having empathy can be overwhelming for us. The beautiful thing about compassion, okay, is the very nature of compassion. It's the ability to see clearly into suffering without holding the suffering ourselves. We cannot be attached to the outcome. And I'm going to teach you a technique to how do we stay not caring, very much caring, but the outcome is not my responsibility, and it's not for me to feel and to fix. Compassion is a renewable resource. A lot of research shows how compassion feeds us. It helps us develop resilience, happiness, and it even enhances the immune system. So I'm not sure if any of you have heard of that research that was done with Buddhist monks, where and I've got a particular Buddhist monk that I'd like to share with you. I think he's got such a lovely, sweet face. This is actually a French gentleman by the name of Mathieu Ricard, who was a geneticist actually in France, and 40 odd years ago he went and became trained as a Buddhist monk. And he's known as the happiest man on earth. So the neuroscientists love testing the monks' brains because they're able to control their minds. And what they have discovered that when these monks, and in particular Mathieu Ricard, when they focus on compassion, they can look at photographs of people suffering. Okay, it was things, I mean, what's happening in the Ukraine, and to see those pictures on TV are just devastating. And when they focus and consciously meditate on compassion for whatever it is that they're seeing, their dopamine levels rise, their serotonin levels rise, they experience gamma waves, which is a gamma wave state in the brain is associated with clarity and pureness of thought and joy. Okay, so actually compassion, it sounds completely contradictory, but can actually bring happiness and not empathy fatigue and empathy burnout. I always bring this in because I'm talking to a lot of leaders about how do they show compassion to their staff when there's still a job to be done. So compassion, it's not leniency, it's humanity. And it's being present with that person, knowing and understanding and validating what it is that they're experiencing and supporting them to still hold on to their job and their responsibilities. And even the smallest act of compassion can have an impact. For those of you who grieved, who have suffered, know when somebody just brings that meal or just picks up the phone to say hello, the difference that it can make. It can be learned, okay? It can be developed. And we all know that, I'm sure that every person is sitting on this call right now because they've experienced their own personal suffering. People that don't suffer often don't have compassion. And then lastly, inertia and pity are the enemies of compassion. Do not pity and do not be immobilized. And moral outrage and fear, all of those are the enemy of compassion. And I want to teach you how do we walk with compassion to support people to navigate forward. Michelle says, compassion is one of humanity's most beautiful traits. Beneath a limit to about how such something can empathize, let me talk to you about empathy, about compassion as being a step forward from empathy. Empathy is a beautiful quality. When a person has no empathy, people with certain personality disorders lack empathy. Autistic children or autistic people often have something they call a broken mirror syndrome. So we have these neurons in our brain called mirror neurons, and our mirror neuron reflects the experience of somebody else. When you see a person, when you watch TV and you find yourself pulling the faces, the same faces as the actors on TV, or somebody eats something sour, your mouth goes like that. That is empathy. Autistic children often don't experience that. So it's a beautiful, wonderful trait to have. But in those that are in the helping profession and have extremes of empathy, like many of you do, it can actually become debilitating. Okay, and that empathy fatigue is where we actually run out of the ability to sometimes empathize. So let me tell you now, and let's start to walk this walk of compassion. And I use the metaphor of a labyrinth. I'm absolutely mad about labyrinths. If I find a labyrinth, I will be walking it wherever I am. That's me riding a labyrinth near Dahlstrom, a real labyrinth. So the beautiful thing about the labyrinth, if we understand this metaphor, is a labyrinth is not a maze. A maze is designed to trap you. You get stuck in these edges. What happens is when you enter into a labyrinth, okay, there's only one way to the center and there's only one way out. And for me, that is what grief is like. Once you enter into grief, okay, you're going to walk the labyrinth. You can't step out of it again. But inevitably, we walk to the center and then we find our way out. We cannot see the path ahead. We cannot see what is going to happen. Okay, let me show you a little bit here with my laser pointer. Okay, we have no idea what's going to happen next. As we go near the center of the labyrinth. We go around this particular labyrinth. There's different labyrinths. I go out, I go upwards, I go back towards the center. We go outwards to the other side. So there's no getting from here to there without walking the path. And it's the same with grief. We have to walk the journey, and we have to walk it one step at a time. And we have to trust the path. Because when we trust the path, we know that there'll be twists, there'll be turns. We'll walk towards and we'll walk away, but inevitably we will walk through. Remember, we don't fix grief. We walk through grief. It's one foot in front of the other. And it's just about knowing that being on that journey, if you do a labyrinth, it's a beautiful experience, and it's quite an archetypal experience of actually managing your emotions, very peaceful, steady, and you're asked to reflect on your emotional experiences as you navigate through a labyrinth. So the metaphor for me of the labyrinth was really linked to Kubler-Ross's cycles of grief. That at any stage you might be feeling any of these experiences. And remember, at the end, I'm going to give you that link to the slide so you can have a look through this. So if sometimes you're calling out, desperate, calling out to God. You might be reflecting, you might be anticipating, you might feel embarrassed, guilt is a massive aspect of grief. And the important thing about this labyrinth is to know that it's fluid. We go through it. It surges and it recedes, and it surges and recedes. And eventually we walk out the other side, and we walk into what we call adaptive grief. In many ways, grief lasts forever, but it doesn't hurt so much. We call it recovery, healing. The wound is always there, but we heal from it and optimally find growth and purpose. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that, and peace of mind. When people don't navigate the maze, that is when they experience maladaptive grief, complicated grief. When you find somebody cycling through the grief, going through it over and over and over again for extended periods of time, or somebody is stuck, or somebody is regressing. By the way, those are symptoms of, if those of you who coaches and you're not therapists, where you need to bring in external support. Okay, but this is to understand that it's okay to go through all of these experiences as long as a person is finding a way to adapt and find some kind of recovery through the process. So I had a client, actually a friend sent her to me, and I remember she sat in my garden, and she had lost her son in a horrific motorbike accident. He was killed in front of her. She was driving behind him, and she saw the accident. And it was 3 years later, and my friend sent her to me and said, Colleen, she just can't move on. And she sat in my garden, and she says, I know I should move on. I've got to move forward. My son would have wanted it. And I said, how are you feeling? She says, I'm feeling like I've got to go on. Everyone keeps telling me I've got to move forward. And I said, tell me how you're feeling. And she started to use these words and started to talk about her feelings. And she just started weeping. And after about 5 minutes, she just became calm. She was able to navigate through a labyrinth in a short period of time because somebody gave her the space to walk the labyrinth, albeit briefly. Her friends were not allowing her that respect and that honor. Why? Because often we feel the pain too much. So the 3 strategies that I have for you to navigate with yourself with compassion and others is through accepting, integrating, and ultimately finding meaning and purpose. So I'll start with acceptance. So those of you who see me train and know me teach about care and coaching and supporting others knows that I'm really, really passionate about the subject. So if I get excited here, just bear with me. This is a graph for me that kind of depicts my life.
Okay, this is kind of what my life is like. I've had fantastic experiences in my life, and I've had devastating experiences. Wonderful things happen at times, and terrible things happen at times. And I'm sure most of you sitting on this call have had a life like this. And the question I always ask, if this is your life, where have you had your greatest learning experiences? Where have you had your greatest learning experiences? And without fail, people say, here, exactly, Anissa, in the lows, in the difficult times. This is not to say we don't wish these on anyone. I don't wish my daughter to have difficult challenges, okay? But she's going to have them because that is what life is like. It's the nature of life. The top experiences, the time at the beach is wonderful. It's a relief, okay? But we don't learn and grow. We learn and become resilient and wise and find courage and find compassion when we go through these difficult experiences. But we've created this society that says for some reason we've got to live in this middle zone, this band of neutrality. I remember when I got divorced, I cried for 3 years. My poor family were beside themselves. My friends just kept saying, go to the doctor, go get medication. And I used to go, why? I'm sad. And I was sad. I was sad because my whole identity had completely shifted. I didn't know who I was anymore as a single person from being a divorced person. My motto for life, they're going to write this on my gravestone, is that sad is not bad. It's just sad. So when you see somebody going through a difficult experience, as the support person, be present, be what I call the sacred space for that person to experience those emotions. Do not go and invalidate. You know how we say to people, don't worry, you'll get over it. Don't get angry. Don't be upset. They're in a better place is my worst comment ever, because I want to say, hey, how do you know? Have you been there? Don't give platitudes. Validate whatever it is a person is experiencing. Be the witness to what a person is experiencing and normalize it for them, because I had a client phone me and say to me, but I was feeling like this, and then I was feeling angry, and then whatever it is okay. A feeling is just that. It's an emotion. It's a messenger to us. Be present and be with your own feelings. If you're feeling sad, be with sad. What we resist has a way of sneaking back at us over and over and over again until we work through the process and learn the lesson that life is teaching us. So do not invalidate your own emotions. Do not invalidate other people's emotions. I always say, has anyone ever told you, don't worry, and all of a sudden worry has flown out of the window? It has never certainly happened in my life. So bear witness, be present to other people's emotions, validate and acknowledge whatever it is your client, your friend, your child, your partner is feeling. Never invalidate it. And know that it is their journey. Remember, that's what compassion is. I'm not there to take this experience away from you. I trust that you have the resilience, that you have the wisdom and the strength to navigate through it. But I will be the sacred space to sit there with it. But I won't take it on to me, because it's yours. It's the beauty of your journey. It's not my journey to take away from you. So accepting, witnessing, validating and normalizing is your first step. And the second step is supporting yourself and another person to integrate. And you're saying it's like a whole new identity. Like, who have I become now that I don't have my partner? Who am I now that I can't bear children? Who am I now that I have no parents anymore? Any kind of experience is creating a whole new identity. And how do we integrate into this new identity is as a collective. When we do it as an individual, we can't find out where we fit and where we belong. So when I was 18 years old, 17 actually, and I was in matric at school, my brother went missing for 5 days in the Okavango swamps. It was the most horrific experience imaginable. And we were busy writing matric exams at the time. And I remember going into school and nobody sat near me. Nobody came near me. And I remember sitting by the tennis courts and nobody came. But my brother was missing in the Okavango swamps, an area teeming with wildlife in one of the worst droughts in history. and nobody spoke to me until one teacher came. And I even get emotional about it to this day. And she sat next to me at that tennis court. And that teacher is one of my best friends to this day. She was powerful enough to be the sacred space, not to fix it, but just to be with me. Connection is how we heal. I always like to say the best thing for a person is another person, and the worst thing for a person is another person. Be the best person. And as a coach, as a partner, as a friend, empower that person, help them find resources, help them look forward. If necessity, support groups, therapists, whatever support it is that they can have, so that they can integrate and find a way to navigate this whole new world that they're inhabiting. And then finally, I almost like to say, seeing grief as a spiritual assignment. And that assignment is to find meaning and purpose. And please, when somebody has just passed on, don't say to the person who's grieving, there's a reason, because that's the worst thing that you can say. But ultimately, we need to find peace, and we do it through finding meaning and purpose. And there's many ways that we can start to do it. I talk about stepping into choice. My favorite author of all time, who I love to refer to, is Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, who was in the Holocaust, lost every single family member. And he said, the one thing that the Nazis could not take from me was my ability to choose my response to the circumstance. And he was in Auschwitz. Go for psychotherapy if it's necessary. I just wanted to mention eye movement desensitization, reprocessing. It's a very new, very profound technique. People are traumatized. It's becoming one of the go-to therapies for rewiring trauma in our brains. Tapping is another alternative therapy. When people are traumatized, they need sleep. If you need to get support in order to be able to sleep, it is the most healing process that you can go through. Non-SDR, non-sleep deep rest protocols, meditation, mindfulness, anything that can allow your brain to settle and just be present in the moment. Movement, the best way to get rid of that cortisol, to get rid of that adrenaline, is to move as much as you can. I know people often feel immobilized and flat and they can't exercise, but if you can move, that will support you. And finding moments of meaning. And this is a picture of my husband's friend who died of COVID. And this was a memorial that we created with cyclists, and we created it on our cycling routes in the cradle of humankind. And I know every time we go past Ed's tree, we salute Ed. We have moments where we connect with him. Journaling is seen to be an incredibly powerful way to process emotions. Using mindfulness, I did mention that. There's even something called grief yoga, which combines movement and presence in order to find some way of navigating through these difficult times. Giving yourself the time and the space. Having a sacred space in your home which respects the person that you've loved, or having a ritual that you perform. And for me, the most powerful thing that you can do to heal from grief is to make a difference. Going and doing acts of kindness, altruistic acts, has a bigger impact on your brain than an antidepressant. And this is my brother, and he died 10 years after he went missing in the Okavango swamps. When Martin died, I took over the Bipolar Association, which he had run. My parents had been in a terrible home invasion where one of their friends was shot, and I became a trauma counselor. When my brother was diagnosed with bipolar, I went and joined the 702 Crisis Center and learned about crisis intervention. When my son was born and I found out that he had brain damage, I started an association and started doing talks about what had happened to him. So finding ways to make a difference was the way I found healing in my life from the difficulties that I had been through. So I have a compassion challenge for you. And I'd like to just mention where this comes from. It was a Johns Hopkins study that did this controlled trial of compassion with doctors with cancer patients. And what they found was that many times these oncologists that these cancer patients were visiting, they were kind of very clinical in their approach. And what they did is that they gave these oncologists a script, literally a script that they had to read when they spoke to the cancer patients. And literally, it was just a message of compassion. And it significantly lowered people's anxiety and raised the response to the treatment that these people were having significantly. And this is the script that was given to the doctors. I know that this is a difficult experience to go through, and I want you to know that I'm here with you. Some of the things that I say to you today may be difficult to understand, so I want you to feel comfortable in stopping me if something I say is confusing or doesn't make sense. We are here together, and we will go through this together. And at the end of the consultation, the oncologist said, I know this is a tough time for you, and I want to emphasize again that we are in this together and that I will be with you at every step along the way. So when they timed the script, they found that it was 40 seconds, and 40 seconds is all it takes. When you say you don't have enough time to be compassionate, you only need 40 seconds. So my challenge is to share 40 seconds of compassion for 40 days. And the most important part is be compassionate to yourself. Self-compassion is your superpower. Thank you, everyone. Please stay on. We're going to stop the recording now. Really appreciate it. And I really pray that this makes a difference to people. If the smallest impact for one person, then my whole life has meaning and purpose. And I really appreciate your engagement and the interaction.